can click on that information, and immediately you'll get to see that information on the screen there. So what we're doing is providing instant access to everything that happens on the ball, every corner, every pass, every shot, every cross, etc. But also the movements of all the players off the ball as well. And then a lot of the data is actually produced automatically. So here you'll see a storyboard of the game from a tactical and a physical perspective. So the number of goals, the number of shots, the possession of the teams, so a lot of tactical information, but then also a lot of physical fitness information as well. So collectively how much distance the teams have covered, how much distance in high intensity, which is certainly a much more interesting statistic, much more interesting piece of analysis if you're a fitness coach, is the intensity that your players are working at. Many fitness coaches that are using the information these days, Paolo, for example, at Spartak Moscow will tell you this, that he doesn't actually look at the distances that the players are covering so much as the intensity that they're working at. So here, for example, we can see that the game finished 2-2. Zenit St. Petersburg, the away team, have covered a lot more distance, and they've actually covered a lot more high intensity distance, and they're taking less time in their recovery, but the game has ended in a draw. It's not too uncommon to see the away team covering more physical distance and activity in the game, because the home team, generally speaking, will have more possession of the ball tactically. It's not necessarily the case. As you can see here, Zenit St. Petersburg have actually had significantly more passes during the game, so straight away and more possession. So straight away you'd infer from this that they've probably been the dominant team in the match. But obviously the most important thing in football is scoring goals, and the game here has ended 2-2. So there's numerous things that you can do. You can break down your analysis. So from the match overview, you can, for example, get a player breakdown. So here we can see a matrix of every single player for Spartak Moscow and the things that they did in the game. It's very interactive, the system. This is why I'm saying it's been built for coaches. So statistics can be very misleading. So it's very important that you're able to put the data into the context of the game. So Ada McGeady may have done 27 passes in the match, but as a coach you'll want to see where on the field those passes were. So, and what players were involved in those passing sequences. So for example, you see this pass here. If I highlight that pass, you can see where the players were on the field at the time that he attempted to make that pass. And ultimately, you're able to see that pass on the video. So what I've done there very quickly is I've gone from a statistic to a piece of analysis, and ultimately the video, because the video is so important in terms of putting that data into the context of the game. If you just look at a number, like I said, it can be quite misleading really, so you just need to be really careful when you're using data and information. All the data within the overview section here is displayed in the analysis visually. So to give you an example, we can have a look at attacking plays, and we have a look at the attacking entries for Zenit St. Petersburg in the game. We'll display the players, and I just want to look at the successful entries into the final third. So you can see where the passes come from, the start of the pass, who has received the successful pass, and what the second phase of play was. So here we can see that's ended up with a successful entry into the final third, and it looks like it's led to a shot on target, so we'll watch that on the video. And we can actually see it's a goal. So you get to understand how the program can be used both from a pre-match and a post-match perspective in terms of instant access to information and breaking the game down. The animation that I showed you a little earlier in terms of tracking all these players' movements gives you the ability to produce automatically some tracking data, some physical fitness data. So here, for example, we can see in the match the distances that the players have covered. So typically, for example, you'll find that midfielders or wide midfielders might cover more distance in a match than centre backs. Your central defenders, maybe your full-backs, depending on the formation, they cover a lot of distance as well. You might see some of this information on the Russian broadcast presented in real time, which shows that the distances covered by the players and the teams. But really, much more important than the distance covered is really the activity profiles of the players. So using speed thresholds through a scientific process, we can actually break down how much of a player's activity is high intensity. So for example, sprint activity, high speed running or running, all the way through to the time and the percentage and the distance they're spending jogging and walking. We can visualize that as well. So here you can see that on a per player basis, which players are covering the most high intensity activity. And if we focus in, for example, just on Spartak Moscow, we can just focus on the high intensity activity. We can see which players are working at the high intensities. So this looks at all activity that's over 5.5 meters per second. And you can manipulate those speed thresholds based on some specific testing you'll do with the club. And so it just shows the importance there of working at high intensities in football. In addition to that, you can also have a look at not just how much time is spent doing those activities, but where on the field the high intensity activities were. So here you can see in the first half, Dimitri here, the number 23, Kombarov is. Which direction is his sprint activity? Is it in a forwards direction? Is it in a backwards direction? What is the average sprint distance? So here, for example, we can see a sprint that he's made into the box, and you get some information specifically around the sprint here, in terms of the distance of the sprint, where it started, where it finished, and again, ultimately, you get to see that information on the video. So we know that it's a sprint that's actually off the ball, and he's tried to make a run into the box to get onto the cross there. So we're not just looking at the total distances that players are covering, we're actually putting it into the context of the game, understanding at what intensities the players are working at, and in which areas of the field, at what times during the match. So these are the type of things you can look to replicate in a training ground situation to make sure that your training programs are very individualised and very relevant to what actually happened in the match situation. So there's a huge depth of information in here, from statistical information to analysis information, also recreating the movements of the players in the match, and ultimately producing the physical data, which will enable the fitness coach and the medical staff and the coaches to try and understand the technical, the physical, and the tactical components of the game. So just give you a flavour of one of the systems that we've built, and we're able to produce some from having cameras within the stadium here. But like in any business, I quite like this model here, which is relevant, like I said, to any industry. And it basically says that unless you're using the data, unless you're using the analysis effectively, then, and applying some knowledge as a coach, applying some knowledge as a manager, applying some knowledge as a statistician, you're going to be making actions, decisions that are based on poor interpretation of information, really. So I really like this model, because it basically says that, Prozone produced data in this area here, but unless you use that information effectively and apply, refine, analyse and sort that information, and apply some knowledge as a coach, and knowledge as a manager, we're never going to have the knowledge and the expertise of a Arsene Wenger or a Jose Mourinho or a Carlo Ancelotti. We're here to really support the coaches so they can take the information, apply some knowledge and trigger some actions around the decision-making process. we're certainly not here to try and replace them. It's very much a marriage of the science and the art, really, the objective Prozone information and the opinion, the subjective information of the coaches. I'll just play a small video here. Again, I'm not sure if you could see or hear that video. It's only a small quote from Arsene Wenger talking about Prozone, and he says, yes, it's a significant advantage because you have more information, but it's then, like any information, it's what you do with the data that is the most important thing, really. So that's quite a nice model to use, whatever industry you're working in. And in terms of using the information, here's a couple of, there's lots of different models here for performance data and coaching processes and using information. I think certainly in the space that we work in, here's some of the possible ways in which the performance data can be used. So obviously one of the areas is managing your current players. So in terms of team selection, benchmarking players against each other, comparing your own players to other players in the league. You can actually use the data to try and calculate and predict player potential. So for example, if you've got academy players that you're trying to develop, benchmarking the academy players to the first team players, albeit under different circumstances and playing demands, is a really nice exercise to assess the development of your academy talent. And like I said, also managing fitness. So looking at the physical outputs from players during the season can help give you an understanding of fatigue, whether or not the players need to rest during busy periods, when they may play a number of games, European games, league games at the same time. So there's a number of ways in which the data can be used for managing your current squad and managing your football club. We also think there's a huge value in the player recruitment process. So looking at player life cycles, trying to understand when is the best time to buy and sell players. So if a player, for example, is coming towards the end of his life cycle in terms of maturity and age, he's performing really well, then you might want to keep hold of that player because his value in the marketplace, his perceived value in the marketplace is relatively low. Whereas you might look at the data and you'll see that the player is at the peak of his performance, but he's starting to get towards the end of his life cycle, and therefore it could actually be an opportune moment to sell the player when his stock is high in the transfer market. So I would say Arsene Wenger, going back to that example, is probably the king of selling players at the right time. So there's been numerous players, the likes of Henry, the likes of Perez, the likes of Vieira, where Wenger has sold those players perceivably at the height of their game, and maybe even with a few years still left. But he's got strong transfer revenue from selling the player at that time, which he's then reinvested in other players and youth development, etc. Also, you can use the data to assess player valuations. So often in football, player valuations are decided by supply and demand, like in many industries. But actually, you can use the performance data to assess the fair and accurate transfer valuations of players based on their contribution on the field as part of that team dynamic. So I think it can also be used in player recruitment. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, it's about bringing information to the fingertips of scouts and coaches in terms of video access, data access, just to make that whole process much more efficient, really. Is player development. So in terms of trying to bring the academy players